And joining us now from Toronto is Keith Stewart, researcher with Greenpeace Canada. Keith, thanks for being on the show tonight.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Keith, British Columbia's Minister of Environment says that it warned Imperial Metals about the Mount Polley mine tailings pond levels repeatedly before this devastating breach. Do you think it did enough to avert this?
Well, I kind of think the government's supposed to act on behalf of the people of British Columbia, people of Canada, to protect us from companies who are trying to cut corners. And the simple fact that they warned the company but didn't force them to clean this up or force them to sort of reinforce this dam is something I think should be of great concern to everyone, and given the large number of tailing ponds we have spread across the country.
And moving forward, British Columbia's Energy and Mines Minister Bill Bennett is saying that the spill will now spur government across the country to re-examine mining policies, keeping in mind, of course, that this accident is the worst of its kind that Canada's seen in at least 2 decades. Do you think that this will lead to more regulatory scrutiny of mines like Mount Polley?
I think right now most governments across the country are kind of hoping people will forget quickly, and we're going to try and make sure that that doesn't happen. What we've seen in Canada over the last couple of decades is a steady shift towards what's called corporate self-regulation. Rather than having government inspectors go out and test things and look at what's happening, they're relying on the companies to do it themselves. And that is not a great system.
But are there no repercussions that the companies now face?
The companies right now, basically, they get warning letters. If they don't do anything, they get another warning letter. And in incidents like this, what happens is there'll be huge economic cost to this as a company. And what we've seen in previous instances, for instance, in the Lac-Mégantic train disaster that happened last year, is the company quickly went bankrupt and the public was left paying for the cleanup and for the damages, because they simply don't have to carry enough insurance. They don't have to put the bonds in place to cover themselves in the event of this kind of disaster. And I think those are the types of things we need to put in place, because when polluters are forced to bear the full financial responsibility of their actions, they work a lot harder at preventing them.
Well, you know, Keith, Imperial Metals, the owner of the mine, says that it doesn't see any sign that the accident will delay the startup of another mine that it's developing in the province. It says that it plans to start operations this year on its $570 million Red Chris mine, which will produce copper and gold and place waste in a pond at the site. Similarly, was the situation in Mount Polley. Now, clearly, this is a big economic boost for the province. Can this waste be placed elsewhere for things to be safer?
Well, I think they definitely could do a lot better on tailings ponds, but like in that particular case of the mine they're trying to start up, the local community has said no, and Indigenous communities in Canada, Aboriginal groups, have constitutional rights which make it very tricky for companies. So I think they've taken a huge hit on their share price. I think they're going to say anything they can to try and make shareholders have a positive outlook on this, but right now, I mean, their reputation is in tatters, and I think all their other operations are going to be a lot of scrutiny. And particularly, like right across the country, for instance, in Alberta, where in the tar sands region, there's 170 square kilometers of tailings ponds. The second largest dam in the entire world, behind the Three Gorges Dam, is in northern Alberta. It's made entirely out of dirt, and it's holding back a huge lake of toxics. And these things, when they burst, the water comes out quickly, but the damage will go on for years and for decades, because the stuff that's at the bottom that comes out more slowly, the mercury, some of the the heavy metals, that's going to get into the environment. It's really hard to clean up, and those are the kinds of things that cause long-term damage. So the company right now is saying, oh, you know, the drinking water quality, you know, the water's not that bad, but the worst is actually much yet to come, and what they're hoping is that, you know, a few years down the road, when that starts showing up, when the fish are being contaminated so people can't eat them, you know, the spotlight they're under right now will be somewhere else, and no one will be paying that much attention.
Well, Keith, one of the issues that Canada is struggling with right now is balancing economic growth with environmental concerns. And one issue is British Columbia is faced with an opportunity to supply LNG, liquefied natural gas, to Asia. The Premier is describing the LNG sector as a once-in-a-generation opportunity to bolster British Columbia's finances, to create tens of thousands of jobs, and to erase $62 billion in provincial debt. This is another area where there are huge environmental concerns. What are they?
Well, when you actually produce the gas, they're using it by a process called fracking. It's not the old-fashioned gas where you drill down a well and you actually have to inject these toxic chemicals underground. Huge concern with groundwater contamination. There's also a lot of boosterism going on here. I mean, around the world, we see everyone touting that they're going to be the next LNG superpower. Not all these projects can go ahead. So I think a lot of it is kind of, there's like about seven or 8 major projects on the books in BC that might go ahead. Likely only a couple of them will. But the BC has also said this will be the cleanest LNG in the world, but they're not actually putting in place the regulations to make that happen. And I think one of the things we've seen in Canada and around the world is simply, saying to companies, promise us you'll do their best isn't enough. You actually have to have tough government regulations, and you have to make sure that those are enforced and that those enforcements have teeth. Otherwise, companies are going to do what they do, which is to operate within the limits of the law at the lowest possible cost. And that's why the laws have to be really strong. Otherwise, you have disasters like this, which have been warned about for years by the local community, by some of the company's own consultants, but they kept building that dam higher, putting more and more liquid into it because it was the cheapest thing to do.
All right. Thank you so much, Keith, for your expertise. Keith Stewart, researcher with Greenpeace Canada.